Okay, I'm going to show you how to turn this pile of reclaim back into usable casting slip. This is white earthenware clay that we have been using to cast pieces with. We have some slightly damp pieces and some bone dry pieces. And we can mix it all back up and make perfectly good usable casting slip with it. But we need to have an understanding of what the ratio of clay to water needs to be. We need to understand how to calculate specific gravity, and we need to also understand a little bit about viscosity and deflocculants, which might seem a little daunting to start with, but hopefully in the next few minutes I will convince you that actually once you've done it once, it's easy to stick to and easy to repeat. So normally I don't put a pile of unused reclaim like this. What I would suggest you do if you want to use your reclaim is to get a bucket and half fill it with water, and then as you're getting pieces out of the mould, your spare and broken pieces, just add those pieces to the water. So I would have a bucket half filled with water and then keep adding spare and broken items to the water, and by the time the bucket is almost full, then I would give it a good mix and then work on specific gravity and see where I am, whether that's the right consistency or not. The problem is if you leave it all to dry and then you try and mix it up, you've got to work a lot harder to break up all the clay and knock it back into a liquid. So when you're casting, you'll always have slip trailing over your mould, and with your plastic tool that you use to take the spare off, if you just make sure you don't pick up bits of plaster in with the clay, all this is perfectly reusable. So I would add this straight to the bucket of water. If you've got bits that have plaster from the mould in, then best not keep them. But anything that you know is just clay, stick it in the bucket. So with this piece we've got quite a big spare line. We call it a spare line because it's the spare clay that you need to have in a casting mould to ensure that the top of your piece is the same thickness all the way from the very top downwards. So we have this margin that we call the spare. Now in this piece I always cast this a little thicker than normal, because it is a yarn bowl and it needs to be durable. So it means that the spare line, this piece of clay, this is quite substantial, and if I was just to throw this away each time we cast it, that would add up to quite a bit of clay. And there's virtually no difference between this and good new casting slip. So obviously the main thing this needs to become slip is water. And we're adding the water back by putting it back into this bucket of water. And there's another ingredient called Deflocculant that we also add, but I'll explain about that in a minute. So as soon as this comes off, stick it in the bucket. And if I was to make a hash of getting this out of the mould, or if the mould had leaked and we had the slip all over the mould, that just goes straight back in the bucket. This clay I will reconstitute, but for now I just put it in there just to stop these walls collapsing. Okay, so you would have added your reclaim, your dry pieces, your spare to the bucket of water. So I would fill the bucket of water between a third and a half full of water, and then add the bits of clay as you're casting. And then by the time you're getting close to the top, not actually at the top of the bucket because then there's no room to mix it without it going everywhere, but by the time you're a couple of inches on this size bucket away from the top of the bucket, then give it a good mix, and then we can check to see exactly where we are in the specific gravity of the clay. So it doesn't really matter. At the moment, if I've got too much clay or too much water, it doesn't really matter because we can adjust that when we come to test. If you're adding clay to the water as you're casting over the course of a few days or weeks, by the time you come to do this, it's going to be quite simple. It'll be quite easy to do because the clay will be very soft, having been submerged in water. With this example, it's not going to be quite the same because I've left bits of clay to turn into greenware, and that's going to take a bit more mixing. But I did that just to show you that even dry pieces of greenware you can throw in the bucket and you can get that back into slip. So I use, on small batches, this is perfectly usable, and this is relatively inexpensive. All you need to get is a paint mixer attachment for a regular drill, and that's all I'm going to be using to mix this into some form of slip that we can then test. Okay, you can see from the consistency of this is really thin. It still needs a bit of mixing, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to add more clay. You can see at the level of the bucket here, there's quite a bit more space. So now I've got the first few chunks of clay mixed in with the water. I'm going to add a little bit more just to try and bulk it up a bit. Okay, let's add a bit more dry clay, and you can see the consistency of it now. You could almost get away with that as slip. You could almost say that is a thin casting slip. But I think I need to add a bit more and thicken that up a little bit more. So you might think, oh, I'm doing all this by eye at the moment. That's not very accurate, which is absolutely right. It doesn't matter at the moment. I'm just trying to get it into a consistency that looks like clay. When we're at that point, then we get all technical and we can get it perfect. Another little point that's worth just saying is when you're taking your reclaim off the moulds when it's still malleable clay, don't screw it up into a ball and put it into the bucket. Just leave it as a flat piece, because a flat piece is a lot easier to break down than, for example, a big solid chunk. If I had a load of these chunks that I needed to turn back into slip, I'll put them in water and leave them for overnight at least, but preferably a few days to really absorb the water before I then try to mix. So I've turned the video off and I've carried on mixing for a bit, because watching me mix slip is not that thrilling. I appreciate that. So I've carried on mixing for another 5 or 6 minutes, and it's got to a stage that's quite critical that I wanted to just show you. So at the moment, the slip now, if you look at that, it's too thick. So it's still lumpy, so I need to keep mixing it to get those lumps out. But this, you could never cast with a slip that thick. But that's really interesting, because I know if we checked the weight, the specific gravity, it would prove that that slip is not heavy enough. It needs more clay added to it. But if you look at this consistency, you wouldn't think that. You'd think, well, that's too thick, I need to add water. So what we do to try and thin the slip down, but without affecting the clay to water ratio, is by adding sodium silicate. Not much of it. In a bucket of this size, I'm going to add Whoosh, that much. And you'll see the difference that that makes to the slip. You see, it's almost magic. It's turned a thick slip into an almost usable slip. We will check exactly if we've got the right clay to water ratio, but at that point I know that it needed thinning down, because you can't keep mixing when it gets to that point. So it does need some deflocculant added to it, but in very small doses. You don't want to overdo it with the deflocculant, otherwise you'll have a slip that isn't really usable until you've bulked it back up with clay. But now it's more usable, now it's on a thinner consistency. Those thicker lumps will bind together and mix in a lot easier. So you can see that that's starting to thicken up again. Now we're blending in some of the lumps. And that's probably not a consistency that we could work with as a casting slip. A little bit thick, so I'll just add another little touch of deflocculant. So to explain what deflocculant actually does to the slip, I'm going to use these little guys, these sheep. So sheep in a field flock together, and if you imagine these representing clay particles in your thick slip, you've got the weight right, you've got the right amount of water, the right amount of clay, your specific gravity is spot on, but it's really thick, so you don't want to add any more water to it. So what the deflocculant does when you add it to the mix is it causes the charge between the clay particles to neutralize, and they move apart, or they deflock. That's what a deflocculant does. And when the particles are not stuck together, you have a much more fluid mix. The particles are able to move more freely, and you've got a much more usable consistency of slip without having dropped that specific gravity on the body of the slip to a level that it becomes thin and ultimately unusable. So that's what deflocculant actually does. It deflocks your clay. That's a few more minutes of mixing, and I think we're getting close to a workable consistency. It's still a little bit thick. I might add a little bit more deflocculant to that just to thin it down a touch, but I think now is a good time to check to see exactly what we've got going on with that, and that means checking the specific gravity. Specific gravity is just another way of explaining how much clay is in your slip, and if you have the right specific gravity, then your moulds are going to cast a lot easier. You're not going to get too much water in the plaster. The mould is going to separate when it's without it spending too long getting the water into the mould, and everything's just going to work much better. If you look at a slip that appears a little bit thick, there's no way of telling whether that slip needs thinning with a deflocculant or with water. There's no way of telling by looking at it. I mean, you have to weigh it in order to check to see how much water is already in it. So the way that we calculate specific gravity is with a pair of scales, and I take a empty bottle and weigh it. That weighs 30 grams. Make a note of that. Fill it with water, weigh that. That weighs 568 grams full of water. So we take the weight of the bottle away from the weight of the bottle with water in it, and we get 538 grams. So that volume of water weighs 538 grams. So knowing that, we can now calculate how much that bottle should weigh when it's full of perfect slip. So with the slip that you're using, you need to know what the right specific gravity is going to be. Your supplier should be able to tell you that. The slip that we sell here at Hobby Ceramic Craft, we actually manufacture it to be 1.85 specific gravity, which means it weighs 1.85 times the same volume of water. You can work with it. A workable consistency is 1.8 would work fine. Obviously the less water in the slip, the less water is going to go into your moulds. So you want to try and keep the body of the slip as high as you can. But let's work with 1.8. So to work out how much this bottle should weigh with 1.8 times the weight of water in it, we need to take the net weight, which is 538 grams, and multiply that by 1.8, which would be times 1.8 gives us 968 grams. So I need to add the weight of the bottle back, so add those 30 grams back. So 968 plus 30, I don't need a calculator for that, I can do that, is 998 grams. So when this is full of slip and it weighs 998, that is the right amount of clay to water for a 1.8 specific gravity. I know that might sound a little complicated and there's lots of calculations there, but honestly it's worth doing. Do those calculations with a bottle of your size, of your choosing, and then just have that bottle standing by with your desired weight on it. So you know this is my slip test bottle and it needs to weigh 998. So you can forget about how you got to that figure. You just need to know that it is going to weigh 998. So let's see how much our slip actually weighs. Okay, this is the slip that we've been mixing up, and as you can see it is fairly thick and gloopy. There's no way we can cast with that, but I don't know by looking at it whether it needs water or whether it needs sodium silicate. If it weighs the right amount and it's still thick, then we need to add sodium silicate. If it weighs too much and it's too thick, then we add water. So let's just check and see. What have we got? We're going for 998, we want 998, and it's currently 1018 grams. So 1018, so we are 20 grams too heavy, which is great actually, because that's easy. We can put water into that and bring that level, that weight down. If we work out actually what that is, 1018, take away the weight of the container, which is 30 grams, we get 988, divide that by 538, and we get 1.836 or 1.84. So that's a usable weight. As I said earlier, we mix our slip here to 1.85 and this is 1.84, so that's more or less the right ratio of clay to water. It's usable, but as you can see it's really too thick to pour with. So if I wanted to use that as it is, I would just add some sodium silicate and that would make it more fluid, but it wouldn't adjust the weight. It would stay the right ratio of clay to water. But what I'm going to do, just to try and bring this down to close to our destination weight, 998, is I'm going to add to that bucket probably half a litre of water, mix it in and then check the weight again. Okay, I've added half a litre to the mix, half a litre of water, and I've mixed it up and I've sieved out a bit of it into this bucket, and we'll just give it a weigh and we'll see. Hopefully it's reduced the weight, but by how much is the question. Now this clay, this slip is still a bit gloopy, it's still a bit thick, but by looking at it I can't tell you whether that thickness is because the slip is still too heavy or whether it's just thick and needs deflocculating. So let's find out. So 998 was the target weight. And what do we got? We have 1003. So 1003. So I'm going to leave it at that. We've come down from 1018, so we've dropped 15 grams of weight by adding half a litre. So if you wanted to get to exactly 1.8, then the half a litre is one bottle. So if you wanted to drop it another 5 grams, I would add, you know, maybe 100, 200 mils of mixable water. But it doesn't matter. I mean, this is close enough. So I know that this is the right ratio of clay and water, but it's still too thick. So I can now with confidence add sodium silicate to that, and I know that that's all the slip needs. It doesn't need any more water. We know that it needs no more water because of the right specific gravity, but a little bit of sodium silicate just to condition it and get it moving, and we're done. Oh, so let's just put this back with the mix. As you can see, it's not bad. It's almost there. I just think if we use that straight into a casting mould, it would probably go in okay, but it wouldn't want to come out. It would get claggy is the description I would use. I'm sure that's a word. And it just would not want to come out of the mould. You'd have to bang the mould a bit to get the slip to flow out. So once again, I know that this is the right weight of clay to water, so it does not need water. It doesn't look too bad, but you can see those bubbles popping to the top of the surface. That sort of suggests that it is still a little bit on the thick side. So let's add just a little poke more of sodium silicate. If you add too much sodium silicate, you'll notice the slip goes really thin and it goes really dark on the surface. The slip will drop out of suspension to a degree. Some of the elements of the clay will rise to the surface and you'll get this black scum appearing on the surface of your slip. It's not ruined, but it's going to take you a long time to mix that back into shape, so it might be worth just putting a lid on that and putting it away for another day. The way that you would resolve that is by adding more dry mix to it and absorbing some of that deflocculant back into a bigger quantity of slip. I think that's perfect. So if I just get a jug and show you what that looks like. Look at that, that's a perfect slip. Perfect slip. I would now, I would then sieve this run it through a plastic sieve and put that back into my casting bench, my pouring bench. Running it through a sieve just to take some of the little tiny bits of hard clay that I've not managed to mix in totally into the tank. And in a ratio, I wouldn't want to put more than, just habit really, I don't want to put more than 25% reclaim into a tank. So when that tank is getting empty, I could add one of these, and that's a 40-gallon tank. So this is a 5-gallon bucket. We're well covered. And it makes full use of all of those scraps of clay that I had to start with. So if you don't reclaim, I would encourage you to do that. It might sound a little complicated with some of the numbers and calculations, but just work out what your destination weight is and use that as your guide. If you fill this up and it's too light, you need to add more clay to your mix. If you fill this up and it's too heavy, you add water. If you fill it up and it's just right, but it's still too thick, that's when you add deflocculant. And just on that point, this was a full bottle when I started this little demonstration, and you probably can't see too well, but I've used hardly any. I would say I've used probably half a capful in a 5-gallon, probably actually a 4-gallon amount of slip there. So use this very sparingly. This should last you a long time. There you go. Have fun, reclaim, and make the most of the slip that you've bought. Waste nothing.